today is by Dr. Kathryn Floyd, who is on the faculty in the art department. She's one of the art historians. She teaches modern and contemporary art, art of the United States, and art of Africa. She studied at Vanderbilt, did her undergraduate work here in anthropology and fine arts, and then went to University of Georgia and University of Iowa for graduate work. And we're really happy to have her here, and I'm just going to turn it over to her. Thank you.
I just want to start out by saying what a treat this is to be able to gather in the actual museum and stand in front of real works of art. This is so wonderful. And it's also so great that we have the opportunity to have a collection like this come to Auburn University, the Arthur Primas Collection. We're really lucky to be able to see this, really what amounts to a kind of whole history of African American art here. It's a wonderful survey. And I hope everyone's had a chance to take a look at all the great pieces that are in here. Of course, you can see that the room is absolutely dominated by these wonderful works by Robert Colescott, which are exciting and troubling and beautiful and ugly all at the same time. And these are really complicated works. And I want to give you today a little bit of background about Robert Colescott. For those of you who might be thinking about a career in art history or going to graduate school, what a great dissertation topic this would make. This is someone who's so important to the history of American and African American art, and really not a lot of good, solid work has been done on him. He's somebody who sort of finally found his place in the 1980s and 1990s, and unfortunately just died a couple of years ago at age 84, 2009 he died, and it would be great to have him here to answer some of the questions about these complicated works, which are both incredibly political, but also very personal as well. So I want to give you a little bit of background about Colescott and talk a little bit about some of the things that he's doing in his works of art, and then I want to look at these three pieces today. Okay. Colescott has said that his works deliver a kind of 1-2 punch, that they draw you in with the bright colors, with the suggestion of narrative, with the figures that are so close to the picture plane, and then when you get entangled in the sort of interest of those elements, then that second something hits you, right? And you're suddenly confronted with all kinds of difficult imagery, right? With imagery having to do with race and having to do with gender, having to do with the history of art, and really with history in general as a concept. A lot of this interest comes out of Colescott's background, his background just as an individual living in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, in his background as an artist, someone who was really had a sort of global training in France and in Egypt and also in the United States. And then also in the sorts of things that are going on in the 1970s and 1980s in the art world. All of those things feed into these very interesting paintings. So Colescott was born in 1925, and he grew up in Oakland, California. His parents were originally from New Orleans. His father was a Pullman porter on the Southern Pacific Railroad, and Oakland was sort of the last stop on the railroad line, and he went as far out of the south as he possibly could, and continued to work as a porter for the railroad. He was also actually a jazz violinist, and his mother was a pianist. And you can sort of see that sense of improvisation in these works that maybe comes out of that jazz background. As a young man, Colescott actually played the drums. He was really interested in music, but he also, from a very early age, was drawing. He was always drawing. And he was lucky enough to have parents who encouraged him in those activities. And he was also lucky because his father was friends with a very important sculptor named Sergeant Johnson, who was someone who was influenced by the Harlem Renaissance, and who was very interested in thinking about how African American artists might incorporate the history of Africa in their works of art. This is the time in the early part of the 20th century when African American artists and others are looking to a kind of pan-African history. They're thinking about how they are connected back to this history, a history that's often shunted, a history that's often not told in history books. And there's, of course, a political angle to this as well, this idea of building a kind of global community of people related to the continent of Africa. And the Harlem Renaissance, in the Harlem Renaissance, artists were encouraged to look back at that history as a way of sort of moving forward, if you will. And Sergeant Johnson was an artist who was very much influenced by those ideas. And so he not only encouraged Robert Colescott to draw, like his parents were, but he also sort of introduced to him this idea of bringing out this history, right, and engaging with a history that's often not told. So Robert Colescott ends up as an army soldier in World War II. He fights in France and then comes back to the United States and goes to UC Berkeley for his undergraduate degree in art. And after he completes this degree, he actually gets this very, very interesting opportunity where he gets to go to France and he actually studies with Fernand Léger, a kind of second-generation Cubist painter. So let's think for a second about what kind of education Colescott has had at this point. At UC Berkeley, he's probably been taught the legacy of European modernism. He's been taught about Cubism and German Expressionism and all of these sort of great fundamental classical modern movements. And then he goes to France, and Fernand Léger continues to teach him about Cubism. Right? And I'm sure that just sitting here and looking at some of these images, you can see, even from his work in the 1980s, that those original lessons of Cubism still coming to the fore. These sort of strange juxtapositions of space, figures that are sort of dissolving into abstract forms. All of this really sort of interesting brushwork that kind of creates boundaries and passages between different elements in the composition. Right? Colescott certainly learned the lessons of modernism and abstraction, and those continue throughout his body of work. Léger also was very adamant with his students at the time that they needed to also make their work something that would communicate with the masses, that would communicate with everyday people. And so in addition to teaching these lessons of Cubism, Léger also encouraged Colescott and his other students to introduce figuration into his works, to make sure there was recognizable imagery in the works that the everyday citizen could connect to. So Colescott has learned about modernism and abstraction, and now he has a teacher who says your work also has to communicate in a particular way. You also want to remember narrative in your work. You want to remember to put the figure in, remember to put recognizable imagery in your paintings. So he has this great opportunity in France. He goes back to California in 1915. He goes back to graduate school. This is the height of abstract expressionism, right? And he is, interestingly, out in the Northwest coast. He's in Northern California. Out in Northern California, artists in that particular region are, like Léger, interested in mixing all of those abstract expressionist forms, that gestural painting that we know from Jackson Pollock and so on. They too are interested in adding figuration into that particular style. So again, this idea of mixing these different legacies from art comes back to Colescott here. Colescott, at this time, 1951 or so, after he's earned his master's degree, becomes an educator. He becomes a teacher. First he teaches in high schools, and then he goes to Portland State University and becomes a college professor of art. And so we also want to think a little bit here in terms of that idea of narrative, right, and recognizable imagery, and also the idea of communicating, right, and teaching someone something. Colescott is going to become more and more aware of who has the power to teach something, right? Who is teaching those lessons that you get in school, right? Who's the teacher and who is the student, right? What is being communicated? So this idea of educating people also is important here. At this time, he gets gallery representation. He's 38 years old, so it's kind of maybe, if we think about artists today, it feels like a little bit of a slow start. And in fact, Colescott's work, in many ways, has been so complex that he's almost sort of slow to gain the kind of recognition that other artists at the time got. But he's 38 years old in 1963, and he gets his first solo show and gallery representation. So he's kind of coming along here. And then he has this really groundbreaking opportunity yet again. He goes to Egypt. He goes to Egypt on a one-year fellowship and then returns in 1966 to teach at the American University in Cairo for 2 years. And here, of course, he is suddenly exposed to a whole new way of looking at art, to a whole new way of thinking about art history. Along with all of those lessons about modern painting that he's gotten in school at UC Berkeley, he's also gotten a particular story of art history. And it's one that, of course, comes from a kind of Western perspective. Right? Art history is a Western discipline. It's a discipline that comes out of the Italian Renaissance and 19th century Europe. And of course, a history that's taught from a particular perspective, a European perspective. Now Colescott goes to Egypt, and he's suddenly confronted with all kinds of very different imagery. And he's confronted with a history of art that, instead of shunting African American contributions and African contributions to the side in favor of white European art, he suddenly has access now to an art history told from an African perspective that puts images of African people in the center rather than at the periphery. So he's introduced to all kinds of new imagery, and he's exposed to a whole new way of thinking about art history, a different narrative, a different story. Right? So very, very important. He also sort of comes to see how America is sort of provincial, right? His eyes are opened here to all sorts of new things, things that he doesn't have access to in the United States. Some of the things that we see in his work that maybe come out of this interest in Egyptian imagery include, for instance, all of those bright colors that you see. Right? Again, that interest in narrative. If you think about Egyptian hieroglyphics, right, they tell particular stories. We see figures that are pushed close to the picture plane. Right? We see figures in profile, strong patterns, strong graphic elements. All of these things are sort of, traditionally associated with Egyptian painting, monumentality, and so on. And again, Colescott is constantly learning, constantly picking these things up. Until 1967, when the Arab-Israeli conflict essentially has the result of kicking out all of the Americans who were in Egypt, and he has to leave, and he goes to Paris again for a year, and then comes back to the United States. So he's really kind of, in a way, sort of similar to the way contemporary artists work today. They're very global. They're constantly moving about, going here and there, and picking up lessons of history from all over the world, rather than these very one-dimensional kinds of education. So he goes back to California, 1970, he goes back to the Bay Area, and let's think about what's happening in the world of art for a moment at this time in 1970. We've got minimalism, right? We've got pop art, we've got this very sort of hard-edged, often very conceptual interest in the art world, art that maybe is empty visually. You can think about those wonderful minimalist cubes, but that's absolutely full theoretically. That has all kinds of ideas and philosophies and concepts behind it, but the imagery itself is very, very plain, right? Sometimes very high finish, and so on. Colescott, along with a number of other artists in California, essentially reject that style. They reject that really hard-edged style of minimalism and pop, and instead they're interested in a kind of funk, right? A kind of improvisational style, and what is sometimes called bad painting. Painting in a way that looks really raw and really rough, right? All those things that are against that kind of high shine finish that we think of when we think of those minimalist cubes. But they're doing it in a really conscious sort of way. They're not painting in a messy, bad sort of way because they can't paint well. They're doing it very consciously as a reaction against that kind of high finish that we see with pop and minimalism. And so Colescott sort of joins that group, sort of, so to speak. Right? And so we see that kind of messy, raw, rough characteristic in his work as well. It's also a style and a moment when people are adding back into art something that's human, something that's expressive, something that's emotional, kind of against all of that really theoretical work of minimalist art. And of course, people are starting to think about history, and they're starting to rethink art history. This is a moment when especially feminist art historians and African American art historians are so important in reminding us what has been left out of traditional art history. And so Colescott is also painting at this time and thinking about all of these things. And I don't have my nice PowerPoint with me today, so I had to make some color copies for you because I had to show you this image, which is probably, if you ever look up Robert Colescott in a history book or an art history textbook, this is the image that you're going to see. This is kind of his breakthrough image and the image that he's so well known for. This is called George Washington Carver, Crossing the Delaware. And you all, I'll hand this out, you all can look at this and pass it around. This is basically Colescott's reworking of that famous image of George Washington crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Leutze. It's an 1851 image, and it's an icon of American art history. And in the original image, we've got George Washington who's crossing the Delaware River in his military garb. Thank you. There's one African American figure in the boat who's sort of marginalized off to the side. You can barely see him. What does Colescott do in this particular image? He takes Emanuel Leutze's original composition and he reworks it. Right? And instead of having the African American figure sort of half hidden and marginalized in the boat, we have to remember that there were lots and lots of African American soldiers in the Revolutionary War. They get left out of history all the time. Colescott brings that history back to the forefront. And he does it in a really sort of humorous but also troubling sort of way. He inserts all of these caricatures that come out of 19th century popular culture, like blackface culture, minstrelry, those very, very racist caricatures that come out of all of those horrible stereotypes, right? The lazy African American, the mammy character, and so on. And so he inserts those images in that original Leutze picture. And of course, George Washington Carver, right, the great scientist and educator and also artist, actually, is there as George Washington. So he has taken history, right, standard established history, taught from a particular point of view, and he's turned it on its head. And in doing so, makes us ask quite a lot of questions. Not only question who's telling us this history, not only questioning the way that we accept images as truth, and in fact that original Leutze image was far from the truth. It was a kind of myth about Washington. But also, in a way, asks us to think about our own reaction. Right? That is at once a kind of humorous image on the surface, and then when you start to think about the meaning of that image, right, and the meaning of those caricatures, and the meaning of those stereotypes, it's incredibly troubling. And when we laugh and when we react to the humor that's there on the surface, we've then almost implicated ourselves in telling that story, right? We have to ask ourselves, why did I have that reaction? Right? How am I going to deal with this history? How am I going to deal with this kind of imagery? So it's very powerful, and the power there is not in just simply telling a one-dimensional story. The power is in Colescott's ability to make us react and to make us think, right? And to make us think about our own reaction as well. So really powerful stuff. And Colescott did this for about 5 years, from about 1975 to 1980. He appropriated great works of Western art history, the canon of Western art history, and inserted all of these caricature-like figures in those works. Van Gogh's potato eaters becomes eat them taters. Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon becomes the Demoiselles d'Alabama, right, with all of these sort of white and black figures from the South. So he's taking these great masterworks, if you will, and making them his own, and in doing so asks us to think about this history. He calls them subversive appropriations. And this is just a quick quote from Colescott about that. He says, "I think that the way I've appropriated paintings is subversive because my version puts into question the ownership of the idea. The fact that the original work can be redone questions its value." Right? The fact that Colescott can have a kind of power over that image questions its value. I think that if I make a painting that has such a strong quality of irony or sass, if I push an idea so far that it's something that really sticks in people's minds, I've put a barrier between my viewer and the original work. Because if people have seen my demoiselles, they're going to think, they're going to think of mine when they see Picasso's. Right? So now if you see this particular image, right, Colescott's image of George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, when you look at the original Lloyd set, you're going to have that memory, right? You're going to remember Colescott's image, and you're going to think further about that history. Now, this was controversial, and Colescott ran into all sorts of trouble with critics, not just with art critics, but all kinds of people who were interested in thinking about this use of caricature. Colescott was really influential on other artists like Kara Walker and Michael Ray Charles and other African-American artists who were reappropriating those caricature images from the 19th century. And people were really worried. They were worried that people would not see the critique that was inherent in that reappropriation. They were worried that people wouldn't understand what Colescott and others were doing, and they were worried that people would just simply look at those caricatures, find them funny, and have so little knowledge about the problems there that they wouldn't question further. So Colescott was very controversial, and in fact he continues to be controversial, especially for images of women. There have been lots of people writing about his images of women. These are complicated images. Right? And Colescott, in a way, sort of courts that controversy. He wants us to have these discussions about these big issues and problems. So in the 1980s, after Colescott had sort of moved through this interest in subversive appropriation, he went out to Tucson and he taught at the University of Arizona. And his style became much more gestural, and his appropriations became much more complicated. They weren't so much appropriations of single works of art that were then sort of turned on their head. They became these kinds of collages of all different kinds of symbols and references and styles. And we see over the last 20 or so years of Colescott's life, things getting more and more complicated and more difficult to read. And that period sort of begins here in the 1980s. It's interesting, in the 1980s, the art world sort of catches up to Colescott, if you will. He's sort of out in front in a way. And we have the development of neo-expressionism, which looks a lot like Colescott's imagery, very brushy, loose kinds of painting mixed with political images. We have the rise of artists who are interested in appropriation. People like Jeff Koons and lots of other artists who are taking original works of art and reworking them and asking us to question things like authorship and history and value and so on. And then in the 1980s, also this kind of attention to what we might call multiculturalism, for lack of a better word. This idea that identity politics are interesting in art and are important to art and society and culture. All of these things Colescott has been dealing with, and suddenly in the 1980s these become popular and more mainstream. And it's in the 1980s and 90s that Colescott sort of finally begins to get his due as everyone else sort of catches up to him. And at this point he is still interested in a lot of the issues that come out of that image of George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware. But it's done in perhaps a more loose and maybe more complicated fashion. So we see, for instance, that he is still interested in images of race and inequality, but he sort of broadens the way that he's looking at that. He's also looking at other types of injustice, other sorts of power imbalances. He's going to take up issues that have to do with gender and sexuality and money and commodities, right, and all kinds of different societal problems. Even the relationship between, say, individuals, right, all of these tensions and so on. So social problems and the like. Here's a good example here of that kind of interest. This is an image that's obviously about smoking, right? 1987. So just a few years after the tobacco industry has been part of what's sometimes called the tar wars, where the tobacco companies are trying to lower the amount of nicotine and tar in cigarettes so that they can keep people smoking, they can keep people addicted to cigarettes. They've been told that they have to put all sorts of warnings on cigarette packages and so on. And here we've got Colescott responding to this societal and cultural problem. And so we see all different kinds of figures, all different sorts of people from history, not just African American figures, but people from different classes, different genders, different walks of life, who all have this very deadly addiction. And you notice here we've got the skulls here, the death's heads, and here even a doctor with a kind of skull-like head, and he's smoking as well. There's a skeleton sort of hovering in the background here. And we've got the African American figure here, who is obviously picking tobacco, references back to sharecropping and the history of slavery and so on. And even he is obviously addicted to cigarettes. The writer here at the center figures in a city, right? So the city versus this kind of rural space here, white and black, young and old, right? High class and low class. All of these people have this sort of problem here. You can also see that Colescott's work here in each of these images is a kind of mashup, we might say, in contemporary culture, a kind of collage of all different kinds of references and styles. So we still have this kind of cubist idea of space, right? We still have these sort of strange juxtapositions of different spaces, strange perspectives, right? We've got this woman in profile here in the center, for instance. And then we've got a kind of bird's eye view of this writer at his desk or table, right? So different kinds of space are juxtaposed. That curtain in the background, the red curtain here at the side, even sort of reminds me a little bit of the Demoiselles d'Avignon, where we have the prostitute coming through the curtain into this really shallow space that's pushed up towards the picture plane. So Colescott has this kind of high modernist element here, but then there's also all sorts of imagery here that comes from things that look like popular culture. Right? If any of you know the cartoons of R. Crumb, it's kind of underground cartoons from the 70s, right? This has a kind of cartoon-like look about it. It has a kind of caricature-like feeling to the way that the paint is handled and the faces of the figures and so on. So there's kind of this juxtaposition of high art and low popular culture as well. Beautiful, right? Beautiful colors. And then this really raw handling of paint. All of these different things that seem to contradict each other are put together. And if you think, too, about this idea of what we might call hybrids, things that are sort of mashed up and juxtaposed and pushed together, those are things that are typically really hard to define. They're hard to categorize. They're hard to tell easy stories about. So when we see figures, for instance, like this Statue of Liberty down here at the far left, who's half white and half black, a kind of hybrid figure, right? Who is this person? Difficult to categorize, right? Hybrids are things that we can't easily define, and so they exactly counter that idea of easy narratives, right? The kind of easy stories and easy history that Colescott is critiquing in things like his George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware. He's asking us to question all those things that we take for granted. Right? Categories are things that stereotypes are based on. Right? Easy sorts of definitions of people. And Colescott's figures always complicate those easy definitions, right? Who are these people? He's not going to answer that for us. Right? He's going to keep that a kind of mystery. He's going to keep that from being put in a box, if you will. Colescott also mixes, as I've been talking about here, humor, right, with really serious subjects, right? Either an aesthetic of humor or cartooning or actual images that can be sort of funny, right, or ironic. That is mixed with really serious subjects like smoking and death, right, or racial issues or history and so on. And I love this quote from Colescott about humor, where he says, if you decide to laugh, don't forget that the humor is the bait. Right? Just like those pretty colors and those really vibrant compositions, it's something that pulls you in. Humor is the bait, and once you've bitten, you may have to do some serious chewing. The tears may come later. So while on the surface these works have this kind of appearance of something cartoonish and funny, and there are instances of humor here, what's beyond that is something that's often deadly serious or tragic. Right? You take this particular figure here, this woman in the center, there's something so cartoony about her, right? The pink hair and the kind of strange body, and yet there's something so vulnerable, sort of tragic about her as well. She's just sort of left there, right in the foreground. Right? And so the humor is the sort of the first part of that punch, as he says, that 1-2 punch. And then we're drawn in, and then we have to deal with these difficult subjects. The last thing that I want to mention about Colescott in general, and sort of these images in particular, is that Colescott is always interested in a counter-narrative. He's always interested in taking what seems to be a story that you can easily tell and easily understand, and he wants to turn that on its head. He wants to keep us from having those nice, neat answers, just as it's difficult to define these particular figures, these hybrid styles, right, these complicated images. Right? He wants to draw us in with that look of narrative and then keep us from really totally making a final statement about what these things mean. Right? And of course, that's absolutely frustrating for an art historian, right, who wants to deal with an image where you can say, this means this, and that means that, and here's how this all comes together and tells a story. Right? These works push back against that desire that we have to do that. Right? We want to find a narrative, and Colescott sort of pushes back against that. Right? And of course, that has a political meaning too. Right? Just like that Washington crossing the Delaware image, that's an easy story, right? One that we can easily consume and kind of hang on to as a sort of myth. Washington wants to push, or Colescott wants to push back against that. Right? So these are very complicated images. All of these are good examples of that idea of counter-narrative. There seems to be something going on here. There seems to be a story that's being told, and yet in the end we can't quite bring it together. Right? We can't quite categorize it and put it in a little box and tidy it up. Here we've got 3 important heroes, right, from American history and world history. Paul Robeson, the great singer and actor and activist in the back. Andre Dumas, the French writer who was part Haitian and part French. And again, George Washington Carver, right, a great figure from American history, scientist, artist, and so on. Here they are sort of hovering above us in their own world, and down below what's going on, something sort of strange, something that might come out of art history. 2 sleeping figures here. In the 19th century, we see lots of paintings with images of African American people sort of lounging around in the sun. Again, it's that sort of stereotype of a lazy African American person. We see this in images by Winslow Homer and William Sidney Mount and so on. But there's also maybe something personal here too. Colescott, living out in Tucson, out in the American West, is as interested in that sort of standard art history as he is in westerns, films, and so on, right, that he watches as a child, images of the Southwest and so on. There's a kind of bandit figure here at the left that seems to be coming in. And what are these people looking at? We can't exactly tell. Are they looking up here at these heroes, right? Or are these the heroes? right? The image isn't clear. And what is going on here with this strange figure who's sort of removed his head, almost like a mask, right? Almost like someone who's changing their identity, perhaps, right? Or is this maybe some reference to an image from, or a story from, say, the Bible? Is this Salome and John the Baptist? Right? All of these references are coming together, and it's unclear as to how we finally can make any kind of sense of this. Again, Colescott's asking us to actually embody these problems about history and art history. This is my favorite image of the three. This is so daunting and frustrating and confusing all at once. And also there's so much here. It's really, really rich at the same time. Colescott really becomes interested in esoteric imagery, mysterious imagery, all kinds of signs and symbols. There's almost a sense of a secret knowledge that's at work here. We have this all-seeing eye hovering over the scene, maybe a symbol from alchemy, maybe a symbol from emblem books having to do with alchemy, the mysterious science of turning materials into gold. Or maybe this is the all-seeing eye of God. Maybe this is the eye of Horus from Egyptian culture. Right? We've got a pool of water here, and many of Colescott's images from this period, images of bathers and Venus figures, they're bathing in this pool of water. This is a very common theme in late 19th century modernist painting, the idea of bathers and people at the seaside and so on. But here we also have this idea of kind of crossing a body of water. Here's the Statue of Liberty, or some figure that looks like the Statue of Liberty. So we have this idea of maybe coming to the United States or coming to America. We have this interesting set of figures here in the center, an African or African-American figure who's hoisted up this white torchbearer. And we might think about that old adage about standing on the shoulders of giants, right? That we have knowledge because others have come before to give us that knowledge. It's an old sort of metaphor about scholarship and knowledge, right? We build on the past, we build on what's come before, and we only are reaching heights because of the people who've gone before. And it's interesting that Colescott makes that figure, right, that sort of foundational figure, an African figure, an African-American figure, who is lifting this torchbearer, right, out of the water and maybe onward in some particular direction. Is this Prometheus, right, the person who brings fire or who brings culture to mankind? And if so, that culture is obviously got another foundation below that we don't necessarily always see or pay attention to. These strange hands sort of coming out of nowhere reminds me a lot of the hand of God that you see in medieval imagery and gospel illumination, right? The divine hand of providence, perhaps. So these are the Ten Commandments. Right? And then we have this airplane, right, that puts us in a kind of different context, and maybe a more modern or contemporary context here. And the title of this work is Knowledge of the Past is the Key to the Future, the Persistence of Memory. And I've been reading lots of criticism of Colescott, and people have said, yeah, that's exactly the answer, that's exactly what he's trying to say. We need the knowledge of the past, and that's the key to the future. But I think there's something more to it than that. Because I don't think Colescott would say that past is so easily unlocked, that we just have this key and we can open all of that knowledge up. I think he's also telling us that we have to work to get at that, right? We have to think about the processes that open up that past, right? It's not so simple, right? And I think in a way, at least as an art historian, I feel like Colescott is also sort of maybe talking to me and to people of my stripe, right, art historians, who also want to take this history of art and sort of unlock the key, right? We want those easy answers in these images. We want to be able to unlock each image and say what it means. And I think for Colescott, the most important point is to say that you have to think about how we make that meaning. We have to think about, right, the power of images. We have to think about the power of history and who's telling that history and who's telling that history. Right? And so Colescott makes us do some work here, and that is really the point. And that's why these works are so powerful. because they don't have that easy answer. Right? And that's what we have to embody, that kind of work. And think about those things always. And these are images that you can go back to again and again, and that's what makes them so rich.